Some fortifications are built to protect. Others are constructed to punish. In 15th century Spain, one notorious castle becomes a place of torture and terror.
Scream, and they'd call it proof of guilt. In the age of the Spanish Inquisition, when women were meant to obey or burn, even a whisper of accusation could end in agony.
Various torture methods are used on prisoners to elicit information or confessions to heresy.
Torture wasn't a crime, it was holy justice, sanctioned by the church itself.
It's not about guilt, it's not about innocence, it's about stop ripping my body apart, I will do whatever you want me to do.
Stay with us as we uncover the twisted devices built to break women's bodies and silence their voices.
Among the most notorious devices said to hail from the Dark Ages, none captures the imagination more.
The last one will steal your breath away. The pear of anguish. What harm can a pear do? Not much, but the same cannot be said of the pear of anguish. It looked like a pear, but it was so different that it could have been a murder weapon.
This particular pear of anguish is to be inserted in either the vagina or the anus. There are larger ones for the mouth.
In the shadowed corners of medieval dungeons, a small metallic object no larger than a pear held the power to extract confessions, punish perceived transgressions, and silence voices forever. The pear of anguish, also known in some regions as the choke pear, earned its deceptively gentle name from its segmented construction, which resembled the fruit's natural curves. Yet nothing about this device was gentle. The mechanism was brutally simple. 4 metal leaves, joined at the tip by a single screw mechanism, formed a closed bulb roughly 3 inches long. When the torturer turned the screw at the base, the segments expanded outward like a blooming flower of steel.
Crushing the maxilla and zygomatic, thrusting the bones into the brain, killing the victim.
The device came in 3 documented sizes, one for oral insertion, another for rectal use, and a third, slightly smaller version designed specifically for vaginal insertion. Historical records from the 16th and 17th centuries place the pear's usage primarily in France, Germany, and the Netherlands, though variations appeared across Europe. Women accused of adultery, heresy, or inducing miscarriages faced this particular instrument with terrifying frequency. The vaginal pear became a weapon of gender-specific punishment, wielded by both religious and secular authorities who saw women's sexuality as something requiring violent control. But it was the damage inflicted that was catastrophic. As the screw turned and the metal petals spread, soft tissue tore, internal organs ruptured. Victims who survived the initial trauma often died later from infection, hemorrhaging, or septic shock. Many of the devices featured decorative engravings, religious symbols, floral patterns, or inscriptions, transforming instruments of mutilation into perverse works of craftsmanship. Some surviving examples include sharp spikes on the expanding segments, designed to anchor into flesh and intensify the tearing. Yet what made the pear particularly insidious was the torturer's control over the degree of expansion. A partial opening might be used during interrogation, the threat of further turning extracting whatever confession was desired. Full expansion, reserved for punishment rather than information gathering, often resulted in permanent disfigurement or death. But the pear was just one tool in an arsenal designed to subjugate the female body. Another device, inspired by a creature that lurks in shadowed corners, would take the concept of tearing flesh to even more visible, public extremes. The iron spider. How does a society transform a mother's source of life into a target for punishment? The iron spider, more commonly known as the breast ripper or spider breast ripper, emerged from a worldview that saw women's bodies not as their own, but as property of the church, state, and husband. This device consisted of 4 sharp claws attached to a handle, constructed from iron or sometimes bronze, each prong curved and sharpened to pierce deeply into flesh. The resemblance to a spider's legs gave it one name, but its primary function gave it another. Medieval and early modern Europe witnessed breast mutilation as a gender-specific punishment for offenses that threatened patriarchal order. Women convicted of adultery, accused of being too seductive, charged with heresy, or suspected of refusing sexual relations with their husbands could face the breast ripper. Unmarried pregnant women, viewed as embodiments of sin, were particularly vulnerable. The message was unmistakable and clear. The female body, especially the breast, a symbol of both sexuality and motherhood, would be destroyed as punishment for perceived moral failures. The procedure unfolded with public cruelty. The woman was stripped and restrained, often tied to a post in the town square. The executioner heated the iron claws until they glowed red, then applied them to the breast. The heated metal seared skin on contact. The claws dug deep into tissue, and then came the tearing. The executioner pulled back violently, ripping breast tissue away from the chest wall. In some documented cases, the breast was completely removed. In others, the victim was left with deep, ragged wounds that exposed muscle and bone. Yet, the pain was only part of the trouble. The physical consequences ranged from severe scarring and permanent disfigurement to fatal hemorrhaging and infection. Women who survived carried visible marks of their supposed shame, unable to nurse children, living with chronic pain, and bearing scars that society intended as permanent records of their crimes. Records from Germanic regions and France contain the most detailed accounts of the breast ripper's use, particularly during the witch trial hysteria of the 15th through 17th centuries. The Hexenhammer, the infamous witch-hunting manual, didn't explicitly recommend this device, but local authorities enthusiastically employed it nonetheless. Yet even this public mutilation wasn't the final word in torture designed specifically for women. Another device awaited those accused of witchcraft, this one designed to inflict agony continuously for hours or even days. The judgment chair. How could a simple pointed seat become one of history's most dreaded instruments, also called the Judas cradle? This tool reduced torture to its most elementary physics, the unavoidable force of gravity combined with strategic penetration. The device consisted of a pyramid-shaped seat, its apex sharpened to a point, mounted on a wooden or metal frame. The victim was suspended above this point by ropes, then gradually lowered onto it. What followed was a methodical destruction of the body that could last for days. Women accused of witchcraft during the European witch hunts faced the Judas chair with particular frequency.
Help me to obtain the favors of your great emperor, Lucifer.
The Spanish Inquisition documented its use, as did Germanic and Italian tribunals. The device's genius, from the torturer's perspective, lay in its versatility. The point could be positioned beneath the anus, the vagina, the tailbone, or any area the interrogator chose, while ropes controlled how much of the victim's weight pressed down. The process began with the accused stripped naked, nudity itself serving as psychological torture in deeply religious societies. Hoisted above the chair by ropes attached to wrists or shoulders, the woman was positioned so the pyramid's point sat directly beneath her. Then came the lowering. Inch by terrible inch, body weight transferred onto the point. The sharpened apex began its penetration. But here's where the Judas chair distinguished itself from quicker methods. The torture was prolonged deliberately. Torturers could adjust the ropes to increase or decrease pressure. They could leave victims suspended for hours, their body weight alone driving the point deeper into soft tissue. Sleep became impossible. The body's natural movements, breathing, and involuntary muscle contractions caused microscopic shifts that increased the penetration and tearing. In time, the damage accumulated horrifically. The pointed apex tore through skin, muscle, and eventually internal organs. Rectal or vaginal insertion led to catastrophic internal injuries, perforated intestines, ruptured bladder, and septic peritonitis. Even when the point was positioned beneath the tailbone, victims suffered spinal damage, crushed vertebrae, and nerve destruction that left survivors permanently paralyzed. And that was only the beginning. Infection was inevitable. The devices were rarely cleaned between victims. Blood and bodily fluids from previous prisoners contaminated the surface. Open wounds became breeding grounds for bacteria, and many victims died not from the immediate trauma, but from septic shock days later in their cells. The psychological dimension compounded the physical agony. Victims remained conscious throughout, unable to escape, watching their own bodies being destroyed by simple gravitational force. Yet the twist that made it even scarier was that it transformed the accused into a passive participant in their own destruction. The strappado. The Judas cradle wasn't the only instrument that transformed the human body into a canvas of suffering. While the pyramid worked through penetration and pressure, another device pursued a different form of destruction entirely. The strappado operated on a principle as old as gravity itself. Victims had their hands bound tightly behind their backs, wrists crossed and secured. A rope attached to these bindings was threaded through a pulley mounted high on a ceiling beam or wooden frame. Then came the drop. In its simplest form, executioners would hoist the victim until their feet dangled above the ground, leaving them suspended by dislocated shoulders. The body's weight became its own torturer, dragging shoulder joints from their sockets within minutes. But interrogators rarely settled for simple. They added variations, sudden drops that jerked the rope taut, snapping tendons and ligaments, weights strapped to ankles that multiplied the downward force.
Needless to say, shoulders aren't supposed to move in this way. The body is not simply going to let this happen, and the muscles, ligaments, and tendons of the back and shoulders resist with all their might.
Hours of suspension, followed by brief respites, then repeated hoisting, a cycle that prevented any healing. This torture began in medieval Italy, where it was called corda, and by the 13th century, it had become a standard tool across Europe, employed by both secular courts and religious tribunals. The Spanish Inquisition documented its use extensively, particularly against women accused of heretical practices. Records from the 1500s detail sessions lasting 6 hours or more, with victims raised and dropped repeatedly until they either confessed or lost consciousness. Now for the science part. The anatomical devastation was systematic. Shoulder joints separated, rotator cuffs torn completely, and nerves stretched beyond repair. Women suffered additional trauma, as breasts were sometimes bound or weighted, and pregnant victims often miscarried from the strain. Survivors faced permanent disability, arms that hung uselessly, hands with no grip strength, and chronic pain that made sleep impossible. Many never regained a full range of motion, their bodies forever marked by angles that defied natural anatomy. Yet even as the strappado stretched bodies vertically, medieval minds were perfecting a horizontal counterpart, a machine that would become synonymous with torture itself. The rack. If you were dragged into a Spanish Inquisition chamber in the 16th century, one sight would freeze your blood more than any other: the rack. This wasn't a metaphor or exaggeration. The rack existed, and it did exactly what nightmares suggested. The rack represented the pinnacle of biomechanical cruelty. Constructed from heavy wood, this rectangular frame featured rollers at each end connected to a ratchet mechanism. Victims were laid flat on their backs, ankles secured to one roller, wrists to the other. With each turn of the handle, the rollers moved in opposite directions, stretching the body along its axis. Greek and Roman civilizations employed early versions, but medieval Europe refined it into an art form. England's Tower of London housed the most famous rack, nicknamed the Duke of Exeter's Daughter, after the Duke who introduced it to Britain in 1447. By the Tudor period, it had become the preferred method for extracting information from political prisoners and religious dissenters. Women accused of treason or heresy found themselves strapped to its unforgiving surface, their protestations of innocence drowned out by the mechanical clicking of the ratchet. The progression of injury followed a predictable pattern. Initially, ligaments stretched to their limits, joints separating with audible pops. Shoulders dislocated first, then hips, elbows, and knees. Vertebrae pulled apart, compressing spinal nerves and sending lightning bolts of agony through the trunk.
Channeling right into your shoulder joints, resulting in catastrophic harm.
At extreme extension, muscles tore from bone, and in rare cases, limbs separated from the body entirely. Victims reported hearing their own bodies break, sounds they would never forget. For women, the rack carried additional horrors. Pregnant victims often lost their children. The position left breasts and genitals exposed to additional abuse. Some interrogators burned sensitive areas, while victims remained stretched and helpless. Others inserted objects, combining sexual violence with systematic joint destruction. Those who survived faced lives transformed by disability. Limbs hung several inches longer than before, joints too loose to support weight, spines unable to maintain upright posture. Chronic pain became a constant companion, and many required assistance with basic tasks for the remainder of their days. The branks. How do you torture someone without leaving visible marks? The answer lies in a device that weaponized silence itself.
You're in charge of making the branks mask,
That is correct.
You're taking away the vision, you're augmenting the hearing.
The branks, also called the scold's bridle, appeared less obviously brutal than other instruments, which made it particularly insidious. Constructed from iron bands that encased the entire head in a cage-like structure, this device featured a flat metal plate or spiked prong that pressed down on the tongue. When locked at the back of the skull, it transformed the mouth into a prison. The Spanish Inquisition employed the branks primarily against women accused of heresy, blasphemy, or basically speaking too freely about religious matters. Its origins trace to Scotland and England in the 16th century, but inquisitors across Catholic Europe recognized its utility. Unlike instruments that drew screams, the branks enforced silence. The victim could not speak, could not explain, could not recant or confess. She could only endure. The tongue plate came in variations: Some were smooth iron that merely compressed the tongue against the floor of the mouth, making speech physically impossible and swallowing difficult. Others featured spikes or serrated edges that pierced the tongue with any attempt to move it. These spikes were rarely long enough to cause fatal bleeding, but they punctured the muscle repeatedly, creating wounds that became infected in an era without antibiotics. The resulting swelling would press against the iron, creating a feedback loop of increasing pain. Women were paraded through the streets while wearing the branks, adding public humiliation to physical torment. The cage prevented eating or drinking. Extended wear, sometimes lasting days, led to severe dehydration. Saliva and blood pooled in the mouth with nowhere to go, sometimes causing victims to choke. The constant pressure on the jaw created excruciating pain in the temporomandibular joint. Women who wore the branks for extended periods suffered permanent damage to jaw muscles and ligaments, resulting in chronic pain and difficulty eating for the remainder of their lives. But the psychological dimension cannot be overstated. Speech is fundamental to human identity, to the ability to proclaim innocence, to pray, to maintain one's sense of self. The branks stripped all of this away. Victims described the experience as being buried alive, conscious and aware, but unable to communicate their existence to the world. This enforced silence often broke women more thoroughly than instruments that inflicted greater physical pain. Inquisitorial records reveal the branks was frequently used in combination with other tortures. A woman might be placed in the branks, then subjected to hours of interrogation she could not answer, followed by accusation of obstinacy that justified escalation to more severe methods. The device created a no-win scenario. Silence was taken as guilt, but the instrument itself prevented any defense. The toka. Can a person drown without water deep enough to submerge them? Yes, they actually can, and the toka proved that drowning is not about depth, but about breath. The Spanish Inquisition perfected water torture through the toka, also known as tormento del agua. This method required minimal equipment, a wooden ladder or bench, cloth, and water, and yet it produced existential terror that left victims convinced they were dying. Inquisitors would strap the accused woman to an inclined bench, tilting her head lower than her feet. This position alone caused discomfort as blood rushed to the head and breathing became labored. Then came the cloth. A strip of linen or cotton was placed over the victim's mouth and nose, creating a barrier between air and lungs. Water, sometimes cold, sometimes scalding, was poured slowly over the cloth. The fabric molded to the contours of the face, sealing nostrils and mouth. The water saturated the cloth and was drawn into the airways by the desperate gasps of someone unable to breathe. The body's involuntary reflex to inhale pulled water directly into the throat and lungs. This was drowning. Not metaphorical or simulated, but actual drowning, interrupted just before death, and then repeated. The sensation triggered every survival instinct simultaneously. Victims thrashed against restraints with strength that snapped finger bones. Bladders and bowels released. Hearts raced to dangerous rhythms. And through it all, the certain knowledge that the next breath would not come. The toka originated in Spanish territories and became standardized in inquisitorial procedure by the late 1400s. Its effectiveness lay in the disconnect between visible harm and internal experience. To observers, the victim appeared merely wet and distressed, but inside, hypoxia starved the brain of oxygen. Water in the lungs triggered coughing spasms that further prevented breathing. The tilted position caused water to pool in the sinuses and throat. Many victims vomited, which added the risk of aspirating stomach contents. Physical damage accumulated with each session. Repeated oxygen deprivation caused brain damage that manifested as memory loss, difficulty concentrating, and personality changes. Lungs developed infections from aspirated water, often contaminated with bacteria in an age before water treatment. These infections frequently progressed to pneumonia, which proved fatal for weakened prisoners in dank cells. The psychological damage was equally severe. Survivors experienced what we now recognize as post-traumatic stress disorder, with recurring nightmares of suffocation and panic attacks triggered by rain or the sound of pouring water. Inquisitorial records meticulously documented toka sessions, noting the number of jars of water used, sometimes 8 or 9, each poured methodically as confessions were demanded between drownings. The precision of these records reveals how normalized the practice became, how clerks could catalog horror with the mundane attention usually reserved for inventory lists. But what made the toka particularly cruel was its repeatability. Unlike breaking bones or dislocating joints, water torture could be administered daily without the recovery time that other methods required. A woman could be drowned to the edge of death in the morning, revived, and subjected to the same torture that afternoon. This made it a favorite for extracting detailed confessions, as victims could be kept in a prolonged state of breaking without the complications of visible injury that might attract unwanted scrutiny from church authorities concerned with maintaining appearances of judicial restraint. The ducking stool. What could be worse than drowning in a body of water, nearly drowning and having to relive the experience over and over again? The ducking stool, also known as the cucking stool, became a common fixture in British and colonial American towns from the 13th through the 18th centuries. While occasionally used on men, court records show it was predominantly reserved for women accused of being scolds, prostitutes, witches, or brewers who sold bad ale. The device appeared in virtually every sizable English town by 1600, and failing to maintain a ducking stool could result in fines for the town itself. But how did it work? The accused was strapped in a sitting position to a wooden chair attached to a long wooden beam, positioned at the edge of a river or pond. At the operator's signal, the beam swung out over the water, plunging the victim down beneath the surface. She would remain submerged until the operator decided to raise her back up, gasping, choking, sometimes unconscious. The mechanics varied by location. Some stools featured a simple chair on a plank that could be lowered into water by rope or lever. More elaborate versions used a seesaw mechanism or a crane-like arm mounted on the riverbank. The accused woman would be strapped or tied to prevent escape, and the number and duration of dunkings depended on the severity of her supposed offense and the whim of local authorities. But what appeared less violent than other torture methods could still prove deadly. Women drowned during the punishment, either held under too long or too weak to recover between immersions. The shock of cold water could trigger cardiac arrest. Inhaling water led to pneumonia in the days following. Beyond the physical dangers, the public nature of the punishment, performed before jeering crowds, often with the woman in soaked, clinging clothes, added layers of humiliation and shame that marked a woman for life in her community. Burning at the stake. The flames rose high against the morning sky, and the crowd gathered close, not in protest, but in witness. For centuries, fire served as both executioner and purifier, transforming flesh and bone to ash while supposedly cleansing the soul of heresy. Women bore the brunt of this punishment with devastating frequency, particularly during the witch trials that consumed Europe and colonial America from the 15th through the 18th centuries. The process was brutally methodical. The condemned woman would be bound to a wooden stake, sometimes seated on a small platform, other times standing. Green wood was often used deliberately because it burned more slowly, prolonging death. Dry kindling surrounded her feet, and when the torch was lit, the experience became unspeakable. Initial burns caused excruciating pain as nerve endings fired their final signals. As flames climbed higher, smoke inhalation might offer mercy through unconsciousness, though not always quickly enough. The body's response to severe burns included shock, fluid loss, and eventually organ failure. Death could take anywhere from several minutes to half an hour. Historical records reveal staggering numbers. In the German city of Würzburg alone, 900 people burned between 1623 and 1631 were predominantly women accused of witchcraft. The Spanish Inquisition, contrary to popular belief, burned fewer victims than secular courts, yet the practice remained widespread across Catholic and Protestant territories alike. England's Marian persecutions under Queen Mary I saw 280 religious dissenters burned in just 5 years. The rationale shifted with the era. Medieval authorities believed fire prevented the condemned from rising at Judgment Day. Later, witch hunters claimed flames destroyed demonic corruption within the body. Women faced particular vulnerability: midwives who lost patients, herbalists with medical knowledge, and those who simply didn't conform to societal expectations found themselves labeled as witches. Property disputes, personal vendettas, and mass hysteria turned neighbor against neighbor, and the pyre became the final answer. But fire wasn't the only instrument designed to extract confession, enforce obedience, or destroy those deemed unworthy. Some tools worked more intimately, targeting specific parts of the body with calculated precision. The heretic's fork. What happens when you rob someone of their ability to speak, yet demand they confess? The heretic's fork answered this paradox with cold efficiency. This deceptively simple device consisted of 2 metal prongs connected by a leather strap. One fork pressed upward beneath the chin, the other downward against the sternum, with the strap fastened behind the neck. The Latin word abiuro, meaning "I recant," was often engraved on the metal, a constant reminder of the confession authorities sought. The mechanics of suffering were straightforward, but devastating. The victim could neither lower their head nor speak clearly without driving the prongs deeper into soft tissue. The fork pierced skin, then muscle, and if pressure continued, could penetrate the tongue from below or puncture the throat. Sleep became impossible. Any relaxation of the neck muscles meant impalement. Hours stretched into days as exhaustion mounted. Physical damage varied with the duration of use. Puncture wounds under the jaw risked infection in an era before antibiotics. Deep penetration could damage the submandibular glands, causing permanent difficulties with salivation and swallowing. Throat wounds sometimes severed blood vessels or damaged the airway. Even after removal, victims bore scars both visible and functional. The Spanish Inquisition employed the heretic's fork extensively during the 15th and 16th centuries, particularly on women accused of heresy or witchcraft. The device served dual purposes: torture to extract a confession, and punishment to humiliate. Women wore the fork publicly, unable to explain themselves, reduced to grunts and gestures while crowds jeered. But the psychological dimension cut deeper than metal. The fork didn't destroy the body outright. It maintained the victim in a state of perpetual pain and humiliation. Speech, that fundamental human capacity, became an act of self-harm. Many confessed not because the fork revealed truth, but because silence under such conditions became unbearable. Yet even this cruelty paled beside punishments designed to permanently mark the body, to transform a person into a living warning for others. Rhinotomy. The face is identity. It's how we recognize each other, how we present ourselves to the world. To deliberately destroy that identity was to commit a violence beyond death and ensure someone who would carry their punishment forever. Rhinotomy, the surgical removal of the nose, reaches back to ancient civilizations. The Code of Hammurabi mentioned it as a punishment for adultery. Roman law prescribed it for certain crimes, and Byzantine emperors wielded it as a political weapon. But across cultures and centuries, women were the ones who suffered this mutilation with particular frequency, almost always for perceived sexual transgressions. The procedure was horrifyingly straightforward. A blade, sometimes heated, sometimes not, severed the nose at the bridge or removed it entirely. No anesthesia dulled the pain. Bleeding was profuse, as the face contains dense networks of blood vessels. An infection followed almost inevitably, given the lack of sterile technique. Many victims died from sepsis in the days and weeks afterwards. Those who survived faced catastrophic consequences. Losing the nose meant losing the ability to warm and filter air before it reached the lungs, increasing susceptibility to respiratory infections. Sense of smell diminished or vanished entirely. Speaking changed as nasal passages altered. But the social death proved most devastating. In medieval Europe, a woman without a nose advertised her supposed crimes wherever she went. Society understood the mark immediately: adulteress, prostitute, transgressor. No veil could hide the absence. Employment became nearly impossible. Marriage prospects vanished. These women existed on the margins, begging or worse, their mutilated faces serving as cautionary tales. But India's history with rhinotomy proved particularly extensive. Ancient texts describe the punishment for unfaithful wives. Even into the 19th century, cases appeared in colonial records. The cruelty lay not just in the act, but in its permanence. Burned victims might eventually die. The heretic's fork was eventually removed, but rhinotomy created a lifelong sentence, transforming the victim into a perpetual example. Every interaction, every glance in a reflection, reinforced the punishment.